The strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people has illustrated the importance of America's investments in and commitments to European security.
Even though maybe the EU is further advanced in terms of regulation than the US is, for reasons which I think we all know, in terms of the problem analysis, I think we see largely eye to eye.
When the shooting stops, the war won't be over. Ukraine must win the peace as well as the war.
Hello, everyone. I am Geisha Gonzalez, Senior Vice President here at the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA. On behalf of the entire team here at CEPA, welcome to Day 3 of CEPA Forum. Over the last 2 days, we have had great conversations about the future of transatlantic defense and security, democratic resilience, and today we zoom in on technology and innovation, the good, the bad, and the we really need to work on this together. A special thank you to our partners that have made this year's forum possible: Google, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Leviathan Design, Lockheed Martin Corporation, and Mercedes-Benz. A special thank you to the embassies of Czechia, Slovakia, and Romania in Washington, D.C., as well as New Strategy Center. And to our media partners, Euractiv, Defense One, and Political. Thank you so much for joining us at this year's forum. And now, to kick us off, a message from our President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova. Over to you, Alina.
Hello, and welcome to Day 3 of CEPA Forum 2022, Meeting the Moment, Allies at a Crossroads. I'm Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of CEPA. Today, we will focus on the digital transformation of the global order. The race for digital innovation has come to define both the shape and direction of modern geopolitics. Beijing's expansive digital authoritarian state continues to present a direct challenge to a global, free, and open internet. Disinformation, challenges to economic competition, and cybersecurity promise to be the defining issues for global democracies in the years to come. Building a strong, democratic, digital future will require unprecedented transatlantic cooperation. And while over the past year, partners have collaborated more closely than ever before, there's much more work to be done. Critical divergences still remain on issues such as platform regulation, data sharing, and cooperation on critical technologies such as semiconductors. And we have seen that progress in Europe-US cooperation over the last year, such as the establishment of the US-EU Trade and Technology Council and the passage of the CHIPS Act, which will commit billions to ensure US leadership in critical chips manufacturing and innovation. These are positive steps in the right direction, to be sure, but there is much more to be done if democracies are to retain our technological edge. At last year's CEPA Forum, Eric Schmidt, the former CEO and chairman of Google, spoke at length about the importance of transatlantic digital unity. As he said, the US needs partners. It needs Europe. We must work hand in hand in hand. And Mr. Schmidt is right. A democratic internet must be achieved through the free flow of data, not protectionism or data localization, which has been the favorite tool of authoritarian states like Russia and China. Democratic governments should work together with the private sector to encourage innovation in areas such as AI, semiconductor manufacturing, and quantum computing. We are all on the same team, and we are all in this race together. Today, we look forward to bringing you the voices leading the way on tech policy and innovation, from elected officials to civil society leaders to tech entrepreneurs. Our speakers will present a forward-looking vision on how to chart a path forward toward a democratically led digital world. Please, as always, be sure to follow the conversations on the CEPA website, cepa.org, and across all our social media using the hashtag #MeetTheMoment. Thank you so much for watching.
Thank you, Alina. At CEPA, we believe that some of the most pressing challenges facing the Alliance require a whole of society approach. With technology, it is no different. It is my pleasure to introduce industry leaders, Google, Microsoft, and Airbnb, to talk about their response to Putin's war in Ukraine. Over to you.
As all of you know, the situation on the front of Ukraine's heroic defense against Russian invasion changes every day. This is what our response should also do: dynamically grow to meet the evolving challenges, both on the ground, helping people in Ukraine, neighboring countries, and in the cyberspace. This is the approach that Google has taken with our robust actions. Across our platforms, Google and YouTube have mobilized to help react to this political and humanitarian catastrophe. One dimension is the value and importance of accurate information. We are aware that we bear a great responsibility in this context on the web. Therefore, the responsible handling of content is particularly important to us. That's why Google has been focusing on combating disinformation and especially curbing Russian disinformation campaigns. Since February, we have removed over 9,000 channels and 70,000 videos related to the ongoing crisis that violated our YouTube policies. We also blocked Russia Today and Sputnik across our platforms. On the other hand, access to reliable information from authoritative sources is equally important. At the request and with the help of the government of Ukraine, we have started rolling out a rapid error rate alert system for Android phones in Ukraine. We also continue to surface trusted news outlets to the users across the world, including in Russia. Another area where Google has taken a leading role is in promoting cybersecurity. Our threat analysis group has been focusing on the safety and security of users in Ukraine and in this region of the world, helping them to protect their information and networks. We warn users of government-backed attackers trying to access their data and offer increased protection to institutions of the civil society that are in a high-risk group of being targeted by malicious actors. Let me also commend the work of many outstanding organizations that provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Ukraine and the refugees from the war that found homes in the neighboring countries. We are proud to support the work they continue to do, and to that end, we have committed over $45 million so far. Google is building further partnerships in the region, focusing on improving conditions for refugees on the labor market, capacity to maintain remote education, and helping Ukrainian companies, like through our Google for Startups Ukraine Support Fund, to strengthen the foundations of the post-war reconstruction in Ukraine.
At Microsoft, we've helped defend key infrastructure in Ukraine, assisting with the detection and disruption of cyber attacks and cyber influence operations, and evacuating the data to the cloud. We've also supported people, communities, and organizations on the ground. Our security teams continue working closely with Ukrainian government officials and cybersecurity staff at public and private organizations to identify and remediate threats against Ukrainian networks. We established a secure line of communication with cyber officials in Ukraine so we could act rapidly to help government agencies and organizations defend against malware attacks. Between January and July 2022, we've delivered more than 120 intelligence tips about the threat activity to Ukraine-based entities. We also completed 173 emergency support missions that provided over 23,000 person-hours of technical support and solution development to governments, nonprofits, and businesses supporting Ukraine. Xbox has partnered with the gaming community to raise millions of dollars, and they've donated millions in product to retailer Humble Bundle's Stand With Ukraine campaign. LinkedIn has provided a $2 million refugee relief fund and $1 million in LinkedIn ad grants to nonprofits that are helping connect displaced job seekers with resources and training to find jobs. We're supporting the International Criminal Court to deliver justice for war crimes in Ukraine, using Azure Cognitive Services to accelerate the collection and analysis of digital evidence. Skype has provided over 43 million minutes of free calling into and out of Ukraine to help families and loved ones reconnect. In June, we issued a report detailing a lot of these activities and going into much more detail about some of the cyber and cyber influence threats that we see coming from Russia that continue to today. As Ukraine continues to defend themselves and rebuild, we at Microsoft stand with them.
The world watched in horror earlier this year as Ukraine was attacked. At Airbnb and Airbnb.org, we wanted to help. Within 4 days of the invasion, Airbnb.org, a new independent nonprofit dedicated to supporting people in times of crisis, announced it would work with governments and NGOs to offer free temporary housing to up to 100,000 people fleeing Ukraine. In just 6 months, Airbnb.org has met its commitment to provide temporary housing to more than 100,000 people displaced by the conflict in Ukraine. All stays are free to refugees and made possible by the generosity of hosts and contributions to Airbnb.org from Airbnb and donors to Airbnb.org. Since February, more than 80,000 individual donors across 95 countries and regions made small dollar direct donations to Airbnb.org to provide housing to refugees fleeing Ukraine. And in recent months, more than 48,000 hosts joined Airbnb.org to open their homes to refugees. This work is a testament to both the power of the Airbnb platform and, more importantly, the global community support for Ukraine and its people. None of this work would be possible without the collaboration of Airbnb.org's partners on the ground who connect refugees to temporary housing. We are thankful for the 40 partner organizations in this response, from IOM, the UN's International Organization for Migration, to NGOs like Nova Ukraine, to national and local government partners in Europe. Behind the 100,000 number are 100,000 individual stories of refugees who have found shelter and hosts and communities who welcomed them. We are humbled by the inspiring generosity of the Airbnb.org community during this moment of crisis. This is just one example of how companies, nonprofits, and governments can work together in times of crisis. I'm here today to reiterate Airbnb and Airbnb.org's commitment to support those in need. We remain committed to working with partners to support refugees from Ukraine and beyond in the months to come.
Thank you, Ginny, Catherine, and Marta, so much for providing your remarks today, and to Microsoft, Google, and Airbnb for your leadership in responding to the crisis in Ukraine. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Acting Director of our Digital Innovation Initiative, Bill Etchingson, for today's conversation on transatlantic cooperation around digital and technology. And so with that, please be sure to continue using hashtag Meet the Moment and go to cepa.org to follow the discussion. Over to you, Bill.
Thank you, Geisha. Welcome to CEPA Forum's Digital Day. I'm Bill Etchickson, the Acting Director of CEPA's Digital Innovation Initiative. We've assembled an exciting panel here with us to discuss the key challenges for keeping the West ahead in the digital race. Vladimir Putin's Russia is exporting surveillance technology. China represents a significant competitor with an authoritarian vision of the internet. How is the West able to compete? On our panel, there's Ili Baraktari, CEO of the United States Special Competitive Project. That's a bipartisan, nonprofit initiative that makes recommendations about how to maintain the US's lead in emerging technologies. They've just put out an important report on the subject. Mr. Baraktari is the former executive director of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. Next, we have Anne-Marie Larsen, Denmark's tech ambassador in Silicon Valley. Prior to her appointment, she worked on tech for the World Economic Forum. And finally, there's Markham Erickson, a Google vice president based in Washington. He leads the global team focused on the application of law and the internet. Let's jump right in. Could each of you tell us just what you believe the Western priority should be to fend off the threat from China, Russia, and other authoritarian states and stay ahead in technology? Maybe Ili, you can start.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. So as you noted, SCSP, we just launched our first report last week. It's called Mid-Decade Challenges to U.S. National Competitiveness. I think going back to your intro, one of the main challenges we face that in this decade, we will probably determine whether or not we're going to live in a world where technologies are built by democratic countries or technologies are going to be dominated by authoritarian regimes. And I'm here focused mostly on China. I know you rightfully pointed out the current crisis we have regarding Ukraine, but when you look at it globally, when you look at what China has achieved in the last couple of years in building and deploying technologies, whether 5G or AI or any other technologies, we face a serious competitor that is building a digital global infrastructure. And then by the end of this decade, if we don't get ourselves organized and resourced properly with our allies and partners, we risk living in a world that is really dominated by the Chinese technologies. So to that end, what we argue in our report last week is we need to come together with all the democratic countries to include our closest European partners and to build a vision about how we're going to run these technologies and then how we're going to offer it to the rest of the world. And I think there are three ways we can do this. Number one is we need to build a joint vision for the future where technology will really plays a dominant role in our life, in our economy, and ultimately our national security. And so to that end, I think we have some really serious efforts underway. The US-EU TTC is really the step in the right direction in getting together with our European partners to determine the way ahead. The second piece we got to do to really get ahead of this problem is really not only build a joint vision, but also rely on each other's comparative advantages. In some areas, Europeans will always be ahead of us. In some areas, they already have better platforms than the United States has. So for example, in 5G, United States still doesn't have its own offer to the rest of the world, but it has to rely on the 5G platforms that are built by Sony Ericsson, and Nokia. And so we have to complement each other. We have to develop a holistic list of technologies that we have to stay ahead because they will ultimately be good for our economy and our society. And then lastly, we've got to find a way to regulate them that is based on our values and norms. So I'll stop there, Bill, but happy to answer any questions.
We'll continue on. Ambassador Larsen, how is this challenge perceived in Europe and in Denmark, but Europe as a whole?
Thank you so much, Bill, and thank you to CEPA for the invitation to be here. It's a great pleasure. How is this perceived in Europe? First of all, I think there's a very strong sentiment that we share that this is not to be left for previous conversations and only around innovation or only around commerce or only around defense, but that technology is geopolitics. And we need to, I think, what should the priorities be? And I think from a European perspective, I want to mention four things. First of all, we need a strong defense for democracy in a digital age. The idea that we could always count on the democratic institutions to prevail, that more and more of the world would sort of turn towards the Western ideals around democracy turned out not to be right. And now the strong defense of upholding democratic values, respect for human rights in a digital age is ever more important. Secondly, that also requires alliances and partnerships. From a European perspective, that's first of all, truly working among the 27 member states and making sure that our approach to this issue is united, is strong, is also, I think, a realization of maybe we haven't done enough as Europeans in both. One thing is governance, but a second one is on the technology development. And then three, I think there's this making sure that if we are to succeed with the Western priorities, Western values around this that are more than transatlantic, I think it really goes to democracies around the world. We need to make sure that technology delivers in some of the global challenges that we're seeing. If we are not to see a turn away from the belief and optimism around that technology can and support a more peaceful, a stronger, a more democratic, a self-governing opportunities around the world, I think that the growing tension around technology and geopolitics will only increase. So making sure that we develop technologies that are delivering on social, environmental challenges, better education, better health systems, tackling the climate crisis is a very, very necessary, not only European, but transatlantic priority.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask though, does Europe really, or follow up on the question, does Europe really see China as the same danger as the United States, as a not only a competitor, but as an authoritarian threat that we should avoid trading with, avoid selling and buying from, above all? I mean, if we looked at telecommunications, Europe is still buying from Huawei, parts of Europe.
There's no doubt that the European relationship with states around the world, including China, is changing rapidly. The European stance on China is right now threefold. It's China as a partner when it comes to combating climate change, is a competitor on economic issues, and it's a systemic rival when it comes to governance systems and values. Recently, and I think, in this sort of geopolitical landscape, we see technology, be that AI, quantum, 5G digital infrastructure, are increasingly taking center stage in geopolitics. And that is also not only now, but I think in the months and the years to come, changing how Europe sees itself in the world. What I think is more important is not only defining ourselves in relationship to others, but talking about the European project. Right now, Europe is squeezed between two of the sort of extreme, right now the main poles in developing technology. And I think as Europeans, what we're now doing is that we are not just left on the chessboard in between these two great players. Europe needs to be a player too. The discussions around strategic autonomy, I think from a Danish perspective, we talk about open strategic autonomy. So the ability to engage with the rest of the world, while also ensuring that Europe, on some aspects, we need to be not entirely dependable upon the rest of the world, but we need to be also stronger and a little bit more independent. Secondly, the other piece around this is to ensure that we actually, from a European perspective, believe that some of the norms and values around how we govern technology should not only benefit the 300 million plus, 350 million plus Europeans, but they can be part of setting global norms around the world. And to that end, I don't see it as a few years ago, we talked about it, a Chinese, an American, and a European approach to internet regulation and tech development. I really think we talk about a transatlantic, a democratic alliance approach to how we perceive technology development and governance and regulation, and a more authoritarian one. And in that one, I believe that there's more that unites than divides us between the US and Europe, and that going forward, it's not only defining European policy based on sort of those two extreme poles, but going more and saying we are an alliance of democracies that are finding the need for collaborating much more on these issues together.
Yeah. Let's bring in the view from the private sector. Mark, we've been talking about the challenge from China and whether US and Europe see it in the same light. How do you see the challenge from China? And do you see both Europe and the United States working together to respond?
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon. Thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here and spend some time with Madam Ambassador and Ilya. Really appreciate the conversation. Look, there's no doubt that in the last few years we're seeing a once-in-a-generation set of challenges. The war in Ukraine, of course, but dramatic strains on fiscal resources. And these challenges really center around what we're going to do about addressing jointly the global economy, global security issues, including issues around geopolitical security in China and sustainability. And we believe at Google that technology companies must rise to the occasion and play a central role in participating with governments, civil society, and NGOs to do this. And I do believe the EU and the US have a strategic role to play here and a constructive role to play. As Executive Vice President Dombrovskis put it last year, the bottom line is that there's no stronger values-based alliance in the world than the one between the EU and the US. But I do think there's going to be some challenges here that we have. And one is we've seen a further erosion of the rules-based trading system. And there's a long-standing trend across a number of sectors, but we're seeing it most clearly in the areas of the digital economy as countries increasingly turn inward around the globe and protectionist around the globe. I saw one report recently that noted that over the last 10 years, the digital economy saw twice as much discrimination against foreign firms than tangible goods trade overall. Second, increasing digital fragmentation and misalignment is making it harder for allies to work together. Countries around the world already are moving away from the 20-year consensus, over 20-year consensus around the open internet by passing restrictive rules that nationalize and fragment the internet. And I think the result of that is a trend toward making the internet less secure, less interoperable, less safe. This fragmentation already was a significant concern before the Russian war in Ukraine, but since February, the dynamics around the war and Russia's approach to sovereign internet regulation have deepened existing fissures and fault lines, pouring oil on what was already a fire. And in all, the G20 nations, and we're coming up on a G20 meeting, but they've adopted over 1,700 legal and regulatory steps for the digital economy just in the last 2 years. And so this is a regulated space. The concern is that it's being done without any real degree of coordination or alignment. And then that feeds into a concern around the third point here, which is that there's a broader trend of digital authoritarianism. Governments are seeking to use the internet and misuse technology in ways that violate fundamental rights as a vector of misinformation. War in Ukraine has highlighted that, as we've seen. So these three trends around rising protectionism, fragmentation, digital authoritarianism, I think they require a concerted action by the U.S. and EU. I'm hopeful that will happen. The TTC is an important venue for the U.S. and the EU to coordinate, but I'm not sure the TTC has risen to this challenge yet. I'm hopeful, but the rules we set with the US and the EU will impact global trends and norms. So I'm hopeful at the end of the day that we'll see that. And on the security point, let me just note, last week we released a white paper in Europe with some ideas and thoughts about cybersecurity and how governments and the technology sector can work together to improve security. One of the tangible recommendations we make is that the EU could require a security assessment when it considers regulations, much as it does in other areas like sustainability, so that we look at those files relative to does it tend to lend to making for a more secure space in Europe or a less secure space.
Yeah, thank you, Markham. I think those are many of the key points. When you hear the private sector and the European representative talk about a common front, do you think we're achieving that, or a common digital European American alliance, or not? Or do you think that we're drifting apart?
Well, I think in a sense, Russia has inadvertently strengthened the coordination and the relationship between the United States and Europe, and geopolitically, and between US technology companies and Europe. We've worked very closely with European stakeholders, European governments on cybersecurity hardening and on dealing with misinformation and government state-sponsored hacking. So that's been positive, I think, and the values that we share are positive. I think where we still have work to do is aligning over approaches to regulation that threaten that are not consistent with those trends of interoperability and openness. And so I'm hopeful we will do that. TTC, I think, gives us the venue. I think the values are there, the execution, the implementation, and I think hopefully using this moment to broaden the perspective from focusing on state sovereignty issues. There's a lot packed into that, and there is a role to play around state sovereignty. We support that, but not in a way that potentially fractures the internet and makes it less secure.
Yeah, I mean, let's try specifically talk about one of those issues, which is the trend to data localization. It's visible, at least in Europe, as a growing trend to keep the data within Europe or even within national borders. How dangerous do you see that? And let's turn to maybe Ili for his feeling about data localization.
Thanks, Bill. So I led the AI Commission for the last 3 years. The purpose of that commission was really to focus on what can we do more with artificial intelligence for national security purposes. And all the data you look at, and no matter from what point of view you come on this issue, is that in this decade, we're facing a challenger that has a signal fusion, that has enormous volumes of data that they can rely on to build their AI platforms. And so what we have argued time and again is that we should look at this from a holistic perspective. And what Markham was saying too is and I was highlighting earlier, we need to sit down and really understand, and I think the Ukraine crisis really highlighted a lot of these things, that the era of great power competition is still here, it's still around. And while Ukraine and Russia is the closest alligator to the shore, China is still continuing to build and deploy platforms around the world. And I don't want to sound here very alarmist, but when you look at the 5G or a 4G global map, China has already developed 70% of the Africa 4G network. And so think about the future we will have to wake up in 2025 through 2030. Their strategies and goals call for everything made in China in 2025, for China being AI global leader by 2030. And so while we're talking about these small pieces of how we're going to govern these issues, I think what we're missing is we miss a joint democratic vision. In our newest report that we just issued, we call for a DemTech alliance, where you can bring a set of coalitions. And these don't have to be coalitions that we are used in the past, like NATO, or we're seeing Quad today, but these can be technology specific. We probably need a coalition that we can offer to the world on 5G, As you know, on the chips piece, if it wasn't for us and the Taiwanese and the Dutch working together, we would not be still enjoying the advantages of the cutting edge manufacturing on the semiconductors. And so we have to be specific about which technologies really will yield the most benefit for our societies and our economy, and then create these coalitions around them with our allies and partners. And Europeans are really at the forefront. I cannot think of any better allies that we have in this space than Europeans. So how do we get together to build these technologies going forward? The third and the last point that I would like to make is, during the Cold War, our governments were in charge of innovation. Most of the stuff coming from our labs, our universities, were really what we enjoy today, from the internet to the maps and everything else. After the Cold War, I think the trend really moved towards private sector taking the lead in the latest and greatest, because the government cut its R&D spending. I think in the 2020s, we have to move now into some kind of a public-private model where we bring together technology companies and our governments to really understand, number one, the threat posed by these technologies, what can we do about it, but ultimately really decide how are we going to use these technologies to improve our, social well-being, economic prosperity of our citizens, and make these technologies really be ruled on our democratic norms and values. And I'll stop there, Bill.
Well, let me just follow up on artificial intelligence and regulation in general, not just on industrial competitiveness, but Europe, and Ambassador Larson expressed it, wants to be the global regulation leader, set the rules for tech. On artificial intelligence, it's the first to propose a regulation being debated now here in Brussels. How do you see that? Is that compatible with the Transatlantic Alliance and the common front against China?
Thank you, Bill. So I've spent a lot of time in Brussels, and I'm really close to both the rapporteurs on the AI Act. I think it's good that Europeans are moving ahead with trying to put some kind of a notional boundaries on what that means. I wish we as the United States would move into defining this, because you have the China model of how the AI is going to be ruled, and then you have the European model. I think my biggest concern about the AI Act is the whole notion that overregulation will lead to European innovation. I've yet to see concrete models of how that would work. There are no historical examples that heavy regulation led to innovation or spurred innovation ecosystem. And so my concern to my European counterparts is time and again of like, look, have you done a cost-benefit analysis of how this act would really generate economic growth in the European continent? So that's one. As you know, in our system, anytime the White House or Congress recommends any kind of bills, we have the Congressional Budget Office that does the cost-benefit analysis of those bills. I'm told that Europeans have not done that cost-benefit analysis of this bill, so that's one. And the second piece is, while you're rushing to regulate this kind of a technology, we should sit down together, and I think this has been done through the TTC channels, on what are some of the things we have to get together at minimum in how we're going to govern AI or any other technologies before you move out and you start regulating one in particular. And by the time even this regulation is regulated or passed, the technology is moving so fast that you have, as I said, you have to go back and like, what kind of mechanisms you're creating between private sector and public sector that we stay ahead and that we provide these technologies to our citizens and increase their welfare compared to what China is doing with their regulation.
Ambassador Larson, I think that's an opening to you to respond. And as the European representative on this panel, how do you perceive this, partly criticism that you're sort of going off by yourself and regulating without a cost-benefit analysis?
Look, I think this question of over-regulating, for more than 20 years, this whole sector has gone completely largely unregulated. And it's been moving fast and in the process broken a bit too many things. Some of the conversations that we're having, it's certainly not regulation for the sake of regulation. It is a genuine concern that I find not only in the public in Europe. I live in California on a daily basis. I find a lot of Americans concerns over what are the implications to my children from spending a lot of time on various social media platforms? What are the the polarization that we're seeing in countries around the world, and frankly, in some of the strongest democracies where polarization is, potentially breaking over countries. This question of how do we uphold and secure our democratic institutions? Maria Ressa, the Nobel Peace Laureate, saying with all the mis and disinformation that's used both by, we see it from sort of state-sponsored influence campaigns to, individuals and groups trying to change the narrative, anti-Western narratives. The mis and disinformation war going on is taking hostage truth, because we don't have a shared set of facts, and without facts you can't have truth, and without truth you honestly can't have functioning democracies. So I don't find this as overregulation. I find this to be a genuine response to a public and a political concern that this has gone largely too unregulated, that some of the decisions that are now left up to the tech companies, which is why in so many of my conversations with the tech companies, there's been a very frank saying, look, you have to regulate us. It should not be us to decide what stays up, what goes down, how to make decisions around, tackling mis and disinformation, how to uphold cybersecurity, without the government also stepping up and frankly taking the responsibility that is of legitimate democratic governments to help set the basic framework and boundaries for how technology should be developed. So, I think the cost benefit analysis that has been done is saying we've in the past 30 years, we've never seen such a threat to democracy as we're seeing right now. I'm not saying that is because of technology, but I'm saying technology plays such a huge part. It is a fundamental infrastructure of our lives, our communities, our democracies, our businesses, the way our markets are operating. And it is a responsibility to get that right. So that is the approach I think, we're taking as Europeans. And I think that, in my conversations with companies around DSA or DMA or even the AI Act, if we expect every piece of legislation to be absolutely perfect, we haven't been paying enough attention to how political processes are made. These are negotiated outcomes that I think actually a lot of not only Europeans but citizens around the world and companies see there is some sort of fairness in, and that they're addressing some of the challenges. They're not addressing all of them, which is why the engagement and the dialogue with tech companies around this is so incredibly important. We still need a lot of that. For me, living in Silicon Valley, the very society that these companies were created from was open, free societies, democracies. They believe in science and opportunity to start businesses, to thrive, to engage globally. If we're not going to be sort of sowing over the branch upon which we're sitting, we need to support that tree, which is democracy and open societies. And then just I want to say a last comment around how, from how are we sort of, working in a world where globalization is radically changing. The past couple of years have shown us, one, that we are now living in a time where one crisis is following the next one. And so the vulnerability and the fragility that we're seeing in our global systems, if we are not to see, frankly and physically high walls going up, we need to address some of the challenges, incredible vulnerable supply chains, and some of our, value chains around these issues where we are dependent and have, too strong dependencies on individual actors. We got to work with our allies, and I think both, Eli and Malcolm alluded to this, to figure out, this is about countering digital authoritarianism in many ways. That requires strong collaboration. I don't think we can do that also without setting the right governance framework for this. I think that the sort of DemTech Alliance and various sort of think tanks and individuals, and frankly, some of the work that Denmark is doing, both with our allies on this, we have a network of cyber and tech ambassadors pointing to exactly to this. How do we collaborate both on sort of chips, not only chips, but technology development, setting rules of the road, and gating around, who is going to set the standards? Is that going to be the West or someone else? So I think that is the cost benefit analysis that goes a little bit broader than just sort of simply economic terms, but figuring out, how to prevail society. And then if I can make one last point, we've been a Danish example, I think, we're one of the leading when it comes to renewable energy. It's been a sort of a windmill fairy tale for the past 3 decades. And that's come because there was a strong public-private collaboration, partly through regulation, partly through a more carrot approach, incentivizing and supporting. And what we're doing here is saying we need more tech, we need more innovation, but that has to support rather than undermining our democratic institutions, that has to support sustainable development. And that is the partnership with which we're going into this, I think, future with the tech companies as well.
Thank you. I mean, I think no one would disagree that we need regulation and what has been responsibilities, new responsibilities in an area which hasn't been regulated, but many of the European regulations target disproportionately, perhaps just because of where the companies are located, American companies. So I was wondering, Markham, these new European, how do you perceive this drive to regulate the internet? Companies like you, are you telling us, please regulate us?
Yeah, so from our perspective, it's not about over-regulation or under-regulation, but smart regulation. I know that can be a trite phrase, but Sundar was our CEO, Google CEO, is one of the first, if not the first, technology CEOs that called for regulation of AI in Europe, because we understand that their governments need to assure that there is trust and accountability in that space. We think a sectoral-based approach is the right way to go. I think as I look, stepping back as I think about this, one of the, clearly there's regulations that are happening. I do get concerned sometimes when we see discriminatory application of those regulations as a way to prop up sort of local entities. And that's point one. But a larger point is, I think often the regulations are developed in a silo. And so, regulation that has to do with privacy may not take into account things like safety or security or competition. So sometimes competition provisions will mandate that we share data with entities without a thought to the security implications of that. We'll understand the desire to try to foment the sharing of data to help other entities, but there needs to be that consideration. Or in the child safety space, there's a thought to locking down information and to giving parents total control over the experience of the child without looking at sort of issues around, security related issues and openness and access issues for the child. So the UK is conducting kind of an interesting approach where they're trying to have a more holistic view that brings in privacy experts, security experts, competition experts, privacy experts. I think that would be helpful. We've seen, for instance, that some of the things that we've done at the request of the EU governments on misinformation with Russia would have been harder to do with some of the interpretations of DSA if they were put into place. So, thinking through as we consider regulations, a holistic approach, I think is going to be important. The other thing I'll note is that why it's so important for the US and the EU to get this right is the rest of the world is watching, and countries that may not share our values will often take provisions that are developed in our regions in the US and EU, but with a slight tweak to them, or with a execution that would not be consistent with our norms, but they're using the precedent of what we do. So we need to have a thought toward how these similar provisions, things that we do in the EU and the US, if those provisions were adopted in a different country, how they might be used. And I think of things like, putting criminal liability for people on in the companies in the country for content removal decisions, where it then becomes very difficult for companies to be able to protect democratic norms when their people on the ground are faced with threats of imprisonment. But I'm ultimately hopeful because we do share underlying values here, and I think we're in a moment where we're trying to get it right. And I think some humility on the part of companies as well as regulators to try to work together, to collaborate, to share information, to try to get the balance right here is ultimately the and with NGOs and consumer and citizen input is going to be crucial, because many of these solutions are not easy to come by, and that's one of the reasons we continue to have these kind of discussions.
Yeah, thank you. Ilya, I mean, one of the themes that seems to come up in a lot of the comments is Europe is regulating, but America is not. it's abdicating. Do you share that feeling? Do you think America needs an AI law, a privacy law?
And so I think what we argue in the report we just released is we have to come up with an American model of AI governance. And I think because our political system is so fractured between state and federal government, and then you have three branches of government, right now there's so many initiatives going on. There's so many bills in Congress. I think the White House is also trying to get ahead of this problem. And then you had at the state level, laws that California has passed. I think in the coming months, we, as Special Competitive Studies Project, will try to project and present what that model would look like. I think we have to get ahead of this. I think we have to try to find a way that balances innovation regulation in our country, because as Ambassador said, our citizens are also concerned. We have to have a model also because right now it looks like only Europeans and the Chinese are out there debating and passing these kind of laws. So in a nutshell, I think in the coming year, we have to come up with an American model of how would this look like going forward, and what are the boundaries of these technologies that we have to use for the benefit of our society, but also to counter what the ambassador was saying, a lot of disinformation that is coming from our adversary. And so I think we will get there. It took 2 years for the CHIPS Act to be passed, so I don't envision this road to be easy because there are many stakeholders. This is a democracy. Civil society plays a critical role. Private sector plays a critical role. So ultimately, we have to find our way of how we're going to see the use of these technologies going forward.
Thanks. We only have a couple of minutes left. So I'd like to go around the table and just have some final thoughts on key priorities for that transatlantic digital relationship. What would be the 2 or 3 things that we need to do? Ambassador Larson?
Thank you so much, and thank you for, I think, a fruitful conversation and discussion on these issues today. One, we're really got to stick to the fact that there's more that unites than divides us. I think whether it is the work of the TTC, the question before is Europe regulating American tech companies? Unfortunately, we don't have enough big tech companies in Europe. Otherwise, they would certainly be regulated too. But this has to be seen as an alliance between democratic forces, whether that is the amazing companies coming out of Silicon Valley, or it is European governments that are stepping up to the responsibility, frankly, which is, if we don't do it, as Yeli said, either one, there's going to be someone else setting the global standards and governance around this, or two, we're going to see a tech backlash. We'll see Luddites, on the street, and we'll start seeing some of that polarization in our societies, deepening even further. So let's make sure that this is, I think as we're sort of coming out of the siloed approach to a lot of this in the past, and I think some of the pieces of legislation coming out now really representing a nuanced balance between innovation, privacy, security. That's why, for me as a tech diplomat, this is not about sort of lobbyists against government. This is about partners meeting around the table, trying to solve some of the real issues together. So in that vein, I think this collaboration and partnership is key.
Good. Markham, some final thoughts from the private sector?
Yeah, so for sure, the EU and US have to prioritize promoting closer strategic transatlantic cooperation. I think that starts with security. There has to be an increasing emphasis on cybersecurity threats and how we can address those, including disinformation, as the ambassador said, disinformation and misinformation. How do we do that? How do we have responsible AI regulation? How do we promote responsible AI? That's going to be increasingly important. Avoiding discriminatory digital regulation. I think, and I understand where Europe is coming from with regard to US companies and trying to foment industries in the US. I don't think this is a zero-sum game. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. And I think the concern, if it is framed that way and is thought to be that way, that becomes impossible to scale globally. It becomes a race to protectionism and to breaking up the interoperability and the openness of the internet, which, by the way, makes the internet more secure, that openness and interoperability. So it gets to the first point. And then I think developing some international technology standards, some standard settings would be would be helpful, again, to help with that interoperability. So I'm hopeful. I think the TTC does provide at least an immediate forum to address some of those priorities.
Thanks. And I think the final word, Eli, it's up to you.
I think both the ambassador and Markham said the right thing. I think we have to come up with a democratic alliance of the technologies really dominate our life for the good, and then try to find a way of how we can regulate them so we avoid harm to our societies. I've said it time and again that China has a list of technologies they want to dominate by the end of this decade. The list is public. Xi Jinping talks about that list of 9 technologies every time he has a speech on technologies. I think democracies have to decide what are the technologies that will benefit our society for the rest of the century. Invest there, increase joint R&D, people exchanges, everything that we have done right during the Cold War, everything we have done right since the Cold War. I think we should rely more on the opportunities that bring us together than differences that take us apart. But I think there's a lot of conversation in this space, and I think usually when friends talk about these things, they usually come to joint conclusions.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks to all 3 of you for a really fascinating discussion. I think there's a lot of reading to be done. Eli, share your report. Markham, we're going to read about tech and security in your report, and I'm sure, as I said, we're putting out some work about Denmark's success in spawning tech unicorns and trying to keep them in Denmark. So thank all of you. You can view the CEPA Forum, the agenda at cepa.org, cepa.org, and you can watch the CEPA Forum, of course, CEPA's social media. Thanks for joining us, and continue to tune in. Thanks until the next.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you to our distinguished panelists. As Bill said, we all have some reading to do. So if you want to find out more about our work on digital policy, please go to CEPA. And we are back. As I was saying, if you want to learn more about CEPA's digital work, please go to cepa.org, find Bandwidth, our digital content stream, to get all of our recent analysis and in-depth research about everything to do with Brussels and DC and tech policy. And please continue to follow the conversation using hashtag #MeetTheMoment. Now we turn from talking about transatlantic cooperation around digital policy to actually what lessons can we draw when it comes to cyber. And so with that, I'm really honored to welcome Dmitry Alperovich, who is the founder of Silverado Policy Accelerator, and our very own Marilyn Magre, who is a senior fellow here at CEPA. Over to you.
What about cyber war in Ukraine? It demonstrates that cyber attacks are not a separate front, but rather an extension of the conflict. Russia has invested a lot of scale and resources into the sophistication of its cyber weapons. Russian invasion includes 3 distinct yet coordinated efforts: destructive cyber attacks within Ukraine, network penetration and espionage outside Ukraine, and cyber influence operations targeting people around the world.
One of the key observations of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is the inability of the Russian forces to effectively use combined arms to achieve battlefield success. That also holds true for cyber. After achieving quite a remarkable success in their initial operation against Ukrainian forces by shutting down their satellite communications via the hack of an American satellite provider called Viasat, and really blinding the Ukrainians in those crucial early hours and days of the war, they were not able to capitalize on that success and drive to Kyiv and ultimately achieve their objective of overturning the Ukrainian government.
Defense against military invasion these days clearly requires a need to disperse and distribute digital services and data centers outside one's country's borders into other countries. The development of international law and norms has become a significant foreign policy issue. It is a contestation of values, ideologies, and strategic interests. Both the US and Five Eyes and like-minded nations on one side, and Russia, China, and non-aligned states on the other side, advocate a set of norms that are inherently at odds with each other. The US and Europe need to understand here that they are on the same side of this battle and should band together. They should jointly reassert leadership in international standard-setting bodies such as the UN, ITU, and mutually develop and recognize each other's standards that relate to modern technologies. The cyber defense of Ukraine relies critically on a coalition of countries and companies. Cyber capacity building efforts for partner countries more generally has strategic importance. Recent cyber attacks in Albania in July, or in Montenegro and in Moldova in August further underline this need. Cyber capacity building is what the e-Governance Academy is currently doing in Ukraine, in the Western Balkans, and in Moldova.
Cyber really has fairly limited applicability on a modern battlefield. Yes, it is used for espionage to provide tactical and strategic intelligence to various forces that are engaged in the conflict. Yes, you can use it for some tactical operations like the Viasat hack to try to have an impact on communications of the enemy. But at the end of the day, what matters in modern warfare is taking ground. It is infantry, it is artillery, it is armor, it is air power. The one thing that may change this is the introduction of modern network-connected weaponry. Now that Ukraine is changing their weapon systems from the old Soviet, largely tech-free weapon systems like D-30 howitzers and old-style Soviet tanks that didn't have any network connectivity, they're now employing HIMARS and other modern systems that can be updated over the air, that can potentially be targeted through cyberspace. So it remains to be seen if we're going to see any of those operations from the Russian military, but I expect even if we do, it'll take potentially many months, if not years, for them to adapt to that new shift. And one of the lessons here is that resilience matters a lot. The Ukrainians have enormous amount of experience since 2014 being under continuous attacks from Russia in cyberspace to quickly rebuild networks when they go down, to enhance their defenses and mitigate and block many of the intrusions that the Russian intelligence services are conducting against their country.
The war in Ukraine provides not only lessons, but a call to action for effective measures that is vital for the protection of democracy's future. A clear-eyed view of the role of cyber warfare in Ukraine and a better understanding of its place in modern warfare is important. But cyber and military success is not sufficient. Rather, Ukraine needs a wider political, economic, and humanitarian support to win this war.
Thank you, Dimitri and Merle. To find out more about our cyber work, please go to cepa.org, where you'll find also our most recent report on Russian cyber capabilities by Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan. And now we continue our CEPA bipartisan tradition by hosting two wonderful speakers, U.S. Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota and Senator James Risch of Idaho. Over to you.
Hello to everyone attending the 2022 Center for European Policy Analysis Annual Forum. I'd like to thank CEPA President and CEO, Dr. Alina Polyakova, for inviting me to share a few words with all of you today. And I'd like to thank CEPA for everything your organization does, your research programs, events, to promote a strong and resilient transatlantic alliance. This forum is happening at such a critical moment. Just over a week ago, Vladimir Putin announced a significant mobilization of Russia's army, calling up 300,000 military reservists, and made a veiled threat that he would be willing to employ nuclear weapons to advance his evil war against Ukraine. Our transatlantic alliances could not be more important than they are right now. You know, I just recently went to Ukraine with Senator Rob Portman, Republican of Ohio, at the end of August, and saw firsthand the strength of the Ukrainian people who are putting their lives on the line every single day to defend their country in the face of the inhuman barbarism of Vladimir Putin. Think about it. There were ballerinas who put on camo and went to the front lines, exhausted nuclear plant workers trying to protect Ukraine from a major disaster, working under incredible stress, surrounded by Russian troops in Zaporizhzhia every day. The cellist playing beautiful melodies in the bombed-out remnants of a town square to remind people that culture and love still exist in his country, all in a brilliant blue and yellow. In Kyiv, Senator Portman and I had an excellent hour-long conversation with President Zelensky, Defense Minister Reznikov, and the President's Chief of Staff. And President Zelensky asked me to tell everyone I spoke to that he and his people are so grateful for the generous, unending, and continuing help that America and our European allies have given to Ukraine in their fight for democracy. I heard the story of how employees at our U.S. Embassy in Kyiv ordered takeout food one day from a Ukrainian restaurant. When they got the food back in Kyiv, our restaurant employee had written on the bag, "Thanks for the HIMARS." That's right. That happened. So together, our transatlantic alliance has kept the Ukrainian people fed. We have kept their country going in the face of unimaginable obstacles. And by building a coalition of over 40 nations ranging from Japan to Poland, we have given Ukraine the military aid they need to fight this war. The strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people has illustrated the importance of America's investments in and commitments to European security. Putin believed the world was so divided that he could attack a peaceful neighbor without consequence. But look what's happening. Russia's actions have been met with near universal condemnation from nations across the globe. And because of Putin's unprovoked invasion, our relationships with democracies around the world are growing deeper. For evidence that our transatlantic bond has never been stronger, just look at Finland and Sweden's decisions to join NATO, a measure we here in the U.S. Senate supported by an overwhelming bipartisan 95-1 vote. These two nations' imminent ascension into NATO is a testament to the continued promise of this great alliance. Our transatlantic security commitments represent investments in upholding democracy and freedom throughout the world. By joining NATO, countries make a sacred pledge to one another that an attack on one is an attack against all. The only time in history this has been evoked was after 9/11, when the U.S. was attacked and our allies rallied to our side. As Americans, we have never and will never forget that. Because NATO doesn't just help bolster our collective security and capacity to address pressing geopolitical threats, investing in NATO also helps sustain the commitment to peace and stability, an abiding conviction in democracy that our countries share. And this enduring alliance has built coalitions and provided crucial humanitarian, military, and economic aid that has allowed Ukraine to hold the lines for their democracy and for all democracies. Russia's war in Ukraine has fundamentally altered Europe and the world, but it has also demonstrated the importance and resilience of our transatlantic alliance as we work together to increase energy supplies for the countries of NATO after what we've seen Vladimir Putin do, as we work together to take in refugees, particularly in countries like Poland, Moldova, and so many others on the border. We have all witnessed the bravery of the Ukrainian people as they fight for their lives and their freedom, and we've been proud to stand with them. I think back to President Zelensky's viral video right after the invasion began. He didn't leave. He stood in the streets of Kyiv and said the simple words, "We are here. We are here. We are here." From that moment on, he and his people inspired the world, a living symbol of courage. That's the message that we must keep sending to Ukraine and every nation struggling under the weight of Putin's war. We are here. Thanks, everyone.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Jim Risch, ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you for inviting me to participate in your annual forum. The Transatlantic Alliance, as the title of this conference suggests, is certainly at a crossroads. The outbreak of war in Eastern Europe has caused us all to rethink the reality of the world we live in. And it has also made quite clear that we can no longer take for granted the peace that we enjoyed only a year or two ago. The new reality in Europe, where Russia is happy to invade its neighbors and China is eager to undermine European values, is going to challenge us all for the foreseeable future. The U.S. and Europe must work together to combat both of these challenges. The U.S. has been increasing its military presence in the Arctic and Europe, most notably in Poland and Romania. Our commitment to helping Ukraine defeat its Russian invaders is strong, and after my visit to Kyiv in June, I am determined to continue to build and maintain that support. For many here in the Senate, it is clear that U.S. support for our Ukrainian and European allies and partners will have a direct impact on the way that other nations with territorial aims, most specifically China, will act. Building European security means once again making substantial investments in soldiers and upgraded military equipment. It also means building resilient societies, businesses, and supply chains. It means resolving the trade disputes between the U.S. and our European partners. And it means strengthening our attention to investment screening, solving the vulnerabilities in our technology, and defending the international organizations and values that we built together. You won't be surprised to hear me say that I and many here in Congress are insistent on the need for Europe to step up and do more for its own security. The U.S. has been all in for 75 years, but we cannot care about European security more than Europe does. Since February 24th, Europe has stepped up in many ways, but some promises have been unfulfilled, and there is a lot more left for it to do. We must both help Ukraine defeat Russia and then work together to help Ukraine rebuild and thrive. When the shooting stops, the war won't be over. Ukraine must win the peace as well as the war. The Transatlantic Alliance must also take steps to rebuild our military industrial capacity. This war has taught us just how quickly all of our military stocks can be depleted, and reminded us that wars do not always develop in the way we expect they will. As the world changes and becomes more uncertain, we all must prepare for multiple contingencies. Europe's armies must rebuild. Congress and I look forward to working ever more closely with the EU and other European nations to jointly improve both European and transatlantic security. Thank you. Thank you for having me here today.
Thank you, Senator Risch, Senator Klobuchar, for joining us at this year's forum. We are honored. And now we turn to emerging technologies and the need for the alliance to harness them in order to have better European security. And I am so pleased to welcome our very own Admiral James Fogo, Joel Hickman, and Joanna van der Merwe about what we need to do in the next 5 to 10 years. Over to you.
In the coming years, in order to compete with Russia and China, the Transatlantic Alliance will need to prioritize the adoption and integration of new, cutting-edge defense technologies.
When it comes to thinking about the defense technology priorities of the transatlantic community over the next 10 years, what comes to mind for me is rather how we think about the technologies, not a specific technology or group of technologies. The first aspect for me is redundancy. How are we balancing efficiency versus redundancy, and are we doing it based on the correct assumptions? How is that impacting technical redundancy and the way in which we build the technical systems? And finally, do we have redundancy in personnel that is sufficient? Do we have enough people who can use the technology? Do we have enough trainers and training opportunities for personnel? And do we have enough parts and personnel who can repair the different forms of technology that we are integrating but already have? Especially the foundational technologies that are key to the functioning of a military. Often when we talk about the resiliency of technology, we look at a specific technology, but I want to know, what is the resiliency of this system that combines old technology, new technology, and people? Do we have sufficient ability to partner in terms of joint operations where both have boots on the ground? But also, do we have the ability to partner sufficiently through supplying technological support, such as supplying of weapon systems, to these less technologically advanced militaries?
The US and its European allies and partners must prioritize space-enabled capabilities, such as geospatial intelligence, global positioning system or GPS, and satellite communications to provide better information to decision makers in real time. We must invest and prioritize in unmanned systems. These have traditionally been sources of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, but have the capacity to do so much more. In the next decade, unmanned systems will be the key to increasing precision on the battlefield. We've seen unmanned systems play a role in Russia's war in Ukraine. They have enabled Ukrainians to monitor the front lines and make significant gains over the last 7 months. Hypersonic propulsion systems developed by the military could be adapted to meet civil and commercial needs, therefore increasing their strategic value.
This technology can compensate for larger, more complex, more expensive systems just by using the principle of speed. Unlike conventional ballistic missiles, hypersonic weapons can fly at least 5 times the speed of sound at low altitude while retaining high maneuverability. This makes them incredibly difficult to detect and defend against. For example, hypersonic missiles can travel so fast and so low they can penetrate pretty much every conventional air defense system that exists today, meaning they can potentially take out strategic capabilities such as aircraft carriers. This would obviously have enormous implications for the US and other NATO countries' ability to meaningfully project power beyond their own borders.
Hypersonics have the potential to shift the global balance of power and transform the capability gap between NATO and near-peer competitors, as well as potential emerging powers. It's insufficient to create offensive hypersonic weapons if you cannot simultaneously defend against them. That's got to be part of the equation as well.
We also need to pay close attention to our competitors when it comes to developing next generation unmanned systems. China's strategy, for example, is often to achieve critical mass through deploying large volumes of drones or swarms of drones with the purpose of overwhelming larger, more complex standalone systems. The prospect of new developments in nanotechnology mean that future unmanned systems could be extremely small and able to evade detection. The eureka moment will be when these systems can self-replicate and proliferate in numbers exponentially. These unmanned systems will also be able to operate undersea as well as in the air and on land, meaning that some of our most vital strategic weapons platforms, such as our undersea nuclear deterrent, could be highly vulnerable to targeting. Given the current rate of progression, in the next 10 to 20 years, we can expect other game-changing capabilities, such as space-enabled direct energy weapons that can hit a moving target at the speed of light, or quantum supercomputers that can problem-solve every conceivable military task, as well as decipher every encrypted communications device due to exponential computer processing power. The key to defending ourselves against all of these radical new technologies and threats is by ensuring that we as a transatlantic community are prioritizing and developing the same capabilities ourselves. Only by doing this can we ensure a credible level of deterrence and an ability to deter our competitors from ever using these weapons in pursuit of their own strategic objectives.
The Russian invasion of Ukraine provides a clear case study that we can use now to assess whether we have these three aspects and have been looking at them sufficiently, and if we are thinking about technology correctly. We can look at the Russian side of the invasion, we can look at the Ukrainian side, the line of contact between the two, but also the struggles and assumptions that we had as NATO, the EU, US in supplying support to Ukraine, a key partner, and use this to understand what priorities we need to change in how we think about technology over the next 10 years.
Thank you, Joel, Joanna, Admiral Fogo. To check out our most recent report on defense technologies, go to cepa.org. I'd like to take a small moment to thank our partners once again, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Mercedes-Benz, Leviathan Design, and Lockheed Martin Corporation. A special thank you to our embassy partners, the embassies of Czechia, Slovakia, and Romania, and the new Strategy Center, and our media partners, Euractiv, Defense One, and Politico. Now it is my pleasure to introduce a conversation with Ambassador Eileen Donahoe of Stanford University and Gerard de Graaf, the Senior EU Envoy for Digital, who just recently took up his post in San Francisco. Over to you, Eileen.
Let me welcome our audience to this fireside chat and introduce our guest speaker, Gerard de Graaf, who is the EU's Senior Envoy for Digital and head of the EU's new office in San Francisco, which just opened on September 1st. Gerard has worked for more than 30 years in the European Commission, most recently as Director for the Digital Economy in DG Connect, which is short for Directorate General for Communications Networks, Content, and Technology. He was centrally involved in crafting two landmark digital regulations, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, which will be a focal point for our conversation. Gerard de Graaf, welcome to the CEPA Forum, and thank you for being here. I wanted to start on a personal level by talking about your new role and responsibilities, which, as I understand it, will substantially revolve around diplomacy vis-a-vis private sector tech companies in Silicon Valley, but also involve engagement with the US government aimed at promoting EU tech governance models and strengthening cooperation in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, known as the TTC. I imagine that this role will be dramatically different from your work over the past 30 years, where you engaged primarily with EU regulators inside the EU Commission. So my first question is, what do you see as your core portfolio and your primary function in this new role in Silicon Valley? How will you spend most of your time and energy? And if it works out brilliantly, what do you hope to accomplish?
Thank you. Good day, Ambassador Donoghue, and very pleased to be here. Thanks to CEPA for inviting me. Why are we here? Or why have we been here now since 2 weeks? The answer to this is actually relatively straightforward, because this is a very important part of the world, Silicon Valley, the western part of the United States, technology-wise. Our economies and societies are rapidly transforming digitally, and here is still a lot that happens. Technology is being developed, new innovations, seeing the light, important companies active here, headquartered here, and of course also in terms of regulation. I mean, California is a quite innovative regulator as well in digital policies. So the European Union has taken the decision, an informed decision, to strengthen its presence on the US West Coast here in San Francisco, precisely because this is an area where a lot happens and where we can learn and we can kind of keep our finger on the pulse for the kind of issues that are going to also be relevant in our future policy agenda. For example, the metaverse, where a lot of effort is being deployed here. Of course, the EU also has something to offer, we like to think, and not only in terms of regulation. We have also a lot of advanced technologies. We have excellent researchers, we have excellent engineers, and a single market, and a lot of kind of opportunities for American businesses and European businesses to cooperate. So we see this very much as a two-way street. We see mutual benefits. We want to support also the relationships through the Trade and Technology Council, as you mentioned, with the US. And I mean, how do we define success? I think that we define success by bringing benefits to the US in terms of like, well, how certain challenges have been resolved or are being looked at and addressed, and learning from the US in how they are moving forward on some of these policies. Because at the end of the day, we are both democracies. We are both we have constitutions underpinned by values, by fundamental rights. We have so much in common. We have a great and deepening trade relationship, and therefore anything that can help promote, sustain, reinforce that relationship is very welcome. And if we can make a very small contribution to that, I think we would be already very pleased.
That's great. So I will note several European countries have previously sent tech ambassadors or other high-level envoys or representatives to Silicon Valley. But I imagine your role may be slightly different and may involve more controversy, specifically because you were so centrally involved in the drafting and adoption of the DSA-DMA package. And as you know well, there are competing views about the ultimate aims and effects of these regulations. Some see them as a groundbreaking effort to rein in big tech and the harmful effects associated, especially with social media platforms. Others believe these regulations are protectionist in nature, in that they primarily target a handful of American tech leaders. How would you describe the core purpose of the DSA and the DMA? What new governance mechanisms were created, and what effects do you anticipate from these new regulations?
Well, technology and the technology platforms, the major companies here, have brought great benefits to the European Union. They are successful companies in the European Union. They are in many ways the biggest companies in technology in the European Union. But I think we all know at the same time that technology can produce also some negative effects on our society. We see the spread of disinformation. There's a lot of illegal content, terrorist material, child sexual abuse material on the internet. There are products that are being sold on the internet that aren't safe, that pose risk for the health of our citizens, for the consumers. There's counterfeit products going around the internet. Those are issues that kind of raise important public policy questions. And I think everybody agrees, and I think that there is a high degree of agreement that these issues need to be addressed. And the platforms, they don't want to be purveyors of disinformation. They don't want their systems to be misused, abused in order to spread illegal content or to serve as purveyors of dangerous products. So in that sense, I think our interests are aligned. I don't think the European Union has to justify why it regulates the internet. I mean, clearly the digital platforms, kind of with all the benefits that they bring, they also kind of create societal problems that need to be addressed, and the European Union is addressing those, and we do not apologize for putting in place these regulatory frameworks. Well, the controversy, I don't think controversy on the objectives. These are shared also between the EU and the US. We have extensive discussions with the EU and the US on the direction of policy. And even though maybe the EU is further advanced in terms of regulation than the US is, for reasons which I think we all know, in terms of the problem analysis, I think we see largely eye to eye. So the intent is to put in place a framework in the European Union that keeps the internet safe as much as possible, and also that ensures that there is effective competition, that if those who have like startups, scale-ups with good ideas, they have a fair chance to be successful in our market. That is what is behind. Well, then, of course, the devil is in the detail. This will have an impact, but not just on US companies. I mean, European companies will also have to change, and companies from China, companies from Japan that address and are active on the European single market will also have to comply. So this is definitely not an instrument that is targeted primarily or even exclusively at the US, but the market is what it is. The US companies are very successful, very present, large in the internet economy, and therefore, of course, and the European market is important to them, they will have to comply with the DSA and the DMA. The DSA is about how to keep the internet safe. If you are very large, you have a great impact on society, you must accept that you take responsibility for the activities that you do. We often make the analogy with banks. Banks kind of course, incredibly important. I mean, imagine an economy without banks. How would it function? It could not. But nobody asks the question, why are banks regulated? Because if something goes wrong, as we've seen 10 years ago during the financial crisis, the impacts, the effects are systemic. They do not recognize borders. Here, the same. The impacts of if something goes wrong on the internet, if terrorist material is being kind of circulating, if the distributed disinformation, the impacts are felt across, well, the European Union and much beyond. And therefore, regulating, making sure that these platforms have systems in place, particularly the very large ones, have systems in place that avoid as much as possible these problems. If they happen, they are detected early on. And once they are detected, they are addressed so that the negative impacts are minimized, is not something where we think this is kind of, people would say, well, EU, what are you doing? This doesn't make any sense. We think this makes a lot of sense. And so the platforms, in terms of responsibility, in terms of making the internet safe, will have to put in place systems, and many of them already do. And they will have to make sure that these systems comply with the Digital Services Act. So, for example, do a risk assessment internally. Is there a risk that our systems can be abused and become a vehicle for spreading disinformation? What about the impact on kids? What about the impact on vulnerable people? can our systems be used in order to create these negative impacts? What about our marketplaces? What about third-party sellers acting on our marketplaces? Do we know who they are? Are we convinced that they can be trusted? If something happens, can the consumer get reimbursed, get a different, a better product? So those are the kind of issues that are central to the Digital Services Act, and which kind of, once the Digital Services Act becomes law in the European Union, will need to be complied with. The Digital Markets Act is on ensuring that these markets remain contestable. And there we have identified, also through our experience in competition law, that some of these companies who are very powerful have become gatekeepers, can set the rules of the game, and in some ways implement or enforce practices that we would regard as unfair. Preference, self-preferencing, kind of giving themselves an additional advantage, preventing companies to be in touch directly with their users, issues around interoperability, and those are the issues that the Digital Markets Act addresses. And yes, it will require some changes to the way business is being done, but that's absolutely normal. So yeah, controversy, I think, not on the objectives. I think they are widely shared. On the implementation of some of the, say, the enforcement, yes, there will be differences of view, and we hope, and that's one of the tasks which we give ourselves, is to contribute to a constructive relationship between the regulator, the European Commission, and the regulated, some of which are established in this part of the world. But if there are kind of, and it can also be for very good reasons. I mean, some of the concepts may need to be tested in court. So we see, I mean, litigation is not always per se negative, but we would like, of course, we would prefer a constructive relationship to an adversarial relationship. But because we think this is in everybody's interest to make the internet safe and to make it contestable. Also, it's a single market approach. So it's one market, one set of rules. It's predictable. Companies that make big investments in the European Union want a predictable framework. They want to know what the rules are going to be like in years to come. They want to access the full market of 450 million users. That's also what the DSA and the DMA offer.
So I agree at a high level there, the objectives are shared. Everybody wants to capitalize on the benefits, protect against the negative effects, and address the negative. But I want to go a little deeper on some of the criticism that has been lodged. As I understand it, one of the core criticisms of the DSA is that it lays out a range of new transparency, due diligence responsibilities at a conceptual level, but is somewhat lacking when it comes to specifics on implementation and leaves that to another entity. And it may lack adequate procedural safeguards related to enforcement. Maybe more importantly, the DMA, some critics argue, while intended to rein in anti-competitive behavior of so-called gatekeepers, might have the opposite effect of locking in existing advantages of the big players. So how do you respond to these criticisms? And is there really a way to get around the unintended effects of solidifying gatekeeper advantage?
Well, maybe starting with the DSA. I mean, the DSA is an extensive instrument. I mean, I would not necessarily recommend people to read it because it will take a couple of hours. It runs for more than 70 articles. It's well over 100 pages of legislation. So the argument that it doesn't contain enough detail, I mean, is a little bit odd, to say the least. I mean, there's a lot of detail. If you write 100 pages in a piece of legislation, I mean, you just do not use only general provisions. And obviously, in some areas, we will need to provide a bit more detail. I mean, there's also, the Commission is empowered to propose and adopt implementing acts and delegated acts, which is, say, the terminology we use in the European Union, to set out even more detail. For example, one of the requirements under the Digital Services Act for the very large on-platforms and the very large search engines will be to undergo an annual external independent audit. So somebody comes in and checks whether these systems are in place and whether kind of companies do what they say they do. well, obviously you will need to develop some more technical specifications and standards that kind of these auditors, when they come in, they have their checklist and go through the checklist. And at the end of their work, they can say, look, I hereby certify that, say, the following elements are indeed in place. So indeed, there is a need for more precision, and that precision will come before the implementation, before the law takes the full effect. In terms of the kind of the principles, I mean, I think they are. We take a systemic approach here. This is not content regulation. So we look at. I mean, actually, it is quite remarkable that we know so little about these platforms. In a way, they're black boxes. We know very little about the algorithms and how they work, what they do, what these platforms do, whereas their effects, their importance in our society is so great. So what are we requiring? We are requiring that these platforms are transparent about what they do. So they have to report. I mean, how much content has been removed, has been reinstated. I mean, how many notifications have we received from citizens or NGOs or companies about content on our platform that may be problematic? What have we done with these notifications? How have we acted on these notifications? What about content moderation? How many people moderate content maybe in languages that aren't so prevalent in the European Union? I mean, how strong is the content moderation? What about our algorithms? How are they programmed? Is it determined whether kind of certain contents kind of come and go viral and others do not? It's valuable information, not just for regulators, it's valuable information for society, for the citizenship at large. And that's what we are requiring. We are requiring risk assessment, as I talked about earlier. I mean, look at your system. To what extent can it be misused, your systems? Because of course these systems, I mean, we all are uploading content and sharing content, etc. To what extent can these systems be misused? And if they can be misused, what are the measures that you are taking as a platform to avoid that this is the case, or to mitigate the effects? Know your business customer, a well-known principle for financial service regulation, particularly in the fight against money laundering. It is not kind of disproportionate to ask a marketplace, a very big marketplace that we all use, to make sure that the third-party sellers that act on that marketplace are actually trustworthy. They deliver the goods that they promise they will deliver, and if something wrong, they'll put it right. So those are kind of examples of what the DSA requires. And then the audit that I talked earlier about. Nothing kind of, you would say, well, this is extraordinary. What is the European Union asking these very big platforms to do? I mean, this is kind of completely useless or disproportionate. So of course, we'll have to see how this works in practice, but we are quite confident that this will improve the transparency and actually achieve what is behind, which is to make the internet safe and to put, I think, as some have said, to put people before profits. That kind of they have a responsibilities, these platforms, and it isn't just about making money. It's also about serving society and kind of being good corporate citizens. On the DMA, the argument that somehow this might solidify, say, the hold of these companies on the market is I think, completely unfounded. I mean, and maybe, I mean, if you look at the GDPR, for example, the GDPR applies to everyone. Yeah. If you are a small butcher in a corner shop, I mean, you are in the European Union, you have to comply with the GDPR as much as companies like Google and Meta and Amazon and have to comply with the GDPR. The DMA only applies to gatekeepers. It doesn't apply to anybody else. So if we're going to impose obligations, responsibilities on gatekeepers, we're not going to impose any of these obligations or responsibilities on the non-gatekeepers, because they are designed for gatekeepers. I don't think that these big companies will argue that these responsibilities, these obligations, these like practices that are no longer allowed in the European Union, that kind of this somehow is going to reinforce their position in Europe. And that's not the signal that I am getting from these platforms. I mean, they're rather concerned the other way around, that this will kind of make it easier for others to compete and take their business. And that's exactly what, of course, the DMA wants to do. I mean, not to take their business, but to promote innovation. We think this is Because that's always also kind of a little bit the criticism that we get in the European Union is we regulate and we kill innovation in the process. Markets that are not competitive, where it's very hard to come in and take on, try to dislodge, say, the leading company, tend to become less and less innovative. Because why would you, if you have a stronghold on the market, I mean, frankly, you're shielded. Why would you innovate? Your old mousetrap is still doing a great job. You can make a lot of money of your old mousetrap. Why would you develop a new mousetrap if the old mousetrap still works? So this is very much a pro-innovation, pro-business. A lot of businesses depend on these companies. If you're a software developer, you're an app developer, good luck. I mean, if you want to be successful without the App Store and Google Play, good luck. If you are a third-party seller and a lot of your business is being done over these very large marketplaces, good luck to say, I'm not going to use you anymore, because suddenly you lose like 30, 40, 50% of your turnover. So these companies are so dependent on these very large gatekeepers that kind of anything that will help in a way make this relationship fairer, more symmetrical, will stimulate innovation, will stimulate competition, is ultimately will stimulate growth in our economies, which we need, particularly in the current economic situation, and will kind of lead to new innovations and also employment. So we make no apology for the DMA, and we see absolutely no risk that the DMA will reinforce the position, the very strong position of the companies that will be designated as gatekeepers.
So hopefully in a future conversation, we'll be able to get into the potential basis of litigation that stems from the private sector companies and their views. Last question for today, though, is I'm wondering, do you anticipate that the DSA and DMA will follow the path of the GDPR and become a global model?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, and the answer is yes, because many countries around the world, democratic countries around the world, are asking themselves the same question that the European Union has asked and is still asking itself. It's like, how do we keep the internet safe? How do we protect our fundamental values? How do we keep the internet and particularly e-commerce market? How do we keep it dynamic and open and contestable? Those are questions that they're not just asked only in the EU. They're asked in this country, in the US, they're asked in Japan, they're asked in Australia, they're asked in Canada, they're asked in the UK, they're asked across the world, in Korea. And a lot of countries have already come to us. When I was still in Brussels, I mean, like every week we had very interesting discussions with countries from around the world, like, well, why have you chosen this approach? And I mean, how kind of will this, should we interpret this provision? We'll have to see. But I mean, interestingly, I mean, on the Hill, Capitol Hill, there's quite a lot of bills have been introduced. I mean, we know the difficult political situation, but a lot of them contain language that almost literally taken from the DSA and the DMA. We see that other countries are also looking. So will other countries take like a comprehensive, will they take DSA and DMA and kind of make it into like their DSA and DMA? Maybe not immediately. Will they take elements out of the DSA and the DMA? Yes, definitely they will. Some of them have already done so.
So Gerard de Graaf, I wish you great luck in your exciting new adventure and hope to cross paths soon in person. And to the audience, let me close by just thanking you for joining this conversation at CEPA Forum 2022. And you can visit CEPA.org to view the CEPA Forum agenda and upcoming speakers and previous days' forum speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you, Gerard, for joining us for this year's forum and for that insightful conversation. As we come to a close, I am just so delighted to welcome Amelia Martin, Program Assistant for External Affairs here at CEPA, and one of the main engines for the CEPA Forum, to the studio. Amelia, welcome.
Thank you so much, Geisha. It's such a delight to be on this side of the screen this year and to help put together this fantastic 3 days of conversations at the CEPA Forum. I've felt like this is one of our most incredible programs we've ever had, and it's been such a delight to work with all of our participants this year. So I have to ask you, what was your favorite part?
You have to ask me. Look, I think like you're absolutely right. It's always such an honor to bring together all of these thought leaders from across, private sector, public sector, civil society. And I will say my favorite part this year was just the consistency in the messaging about who gets to determine the future. I think Defense Minister Reznikov said it best, like, are we going to let the authoritarians determine our future, or are democracies going to determine our future? And so for me, that was just, really refreshing, empowering, and a positive move in these really uncertain times. I will pose it to you. What was your favorite part? You got to see both the back end and the front end of the forum. What was your highlight?
Well, I think to your point, it was really important to see those the Transatlantic Leadership Award recipients. In these times of crisis and pain and a challenge, we often look to our leaders to guide us and to give us not only hope, but also insight and understanding and a feeling of connection. And I think that the prime ministers of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland did such a fantastic job of highlighting the things that connect us and bind us, the importance, but also the precarity of these values that we hold dear, and the importance of continuing to persevere and highlight those. So I thought that was a really great summation of all of the values around our forum.
Amelia, that is so absolutely on target, because CEPA throughout its history, that's been, the Baltic states and Poland have been so core to our DNA and the work that we do. So for me, I would absolutely agree with you. It's great to have them be honored. It's great to have them be the leaders. And in true CEPA tradition, it's also great that they were highlighted as the same time that we highlighted our democracy fellows, right? So the new effort that CEPA launched to be able to provide a platform for independent voices that are victims of Putin's war. So you get the leadership on the end of the prime minister speaking, and then you also get to see how we're actually getting that to action by empowering the next generation, including you, the next generation of leaders. If there was one discussion that really stood out to you, what would you say that was? What would you encourage anybody, if you're like, you missed 2 of the days of CEPA Forum or all 3 days, this is the one thing you need to watch to catch up? What would you say?
That's such a tough question. We had such a wonderful collection of conversations at this year's forum. And I think that those dialogues and those discussions allow us to open the door to new debates and new ways of looking at things. I definitely would have to say that U.S. support for Ukraine stood out to me as deeply informative, timely, a very important way to observe where we stand in Russia's war on Ukraine, where we're going, and how that's going to shape the architecture of the effort forward, as well as the United States efforts to fund the war effort, where that money should be going, where it is going, and how all of these things convene. So I really would encourage people to watch that conversation if they happen to miss the first day, but I have to turn that one back to you as well, because it's so hard to choose.
Yeah, I think it is. But I will say, if there's something that you should catch up on, if you miss some of the parts, I think it's Defense Minister Reznikov is definitely a must watch, because it is really giving a soul to so many of the words that we heard across the board, including, just today, Senator Klobuchar, we are here is so critical, and it just reveals so much about the Ukrainian spirit. And I think we're all inspired, even here. I mean, in our day to day, in everything that we do, in our work, in our conversations, in our events, in our reports, in our social media channels, our support for Ukraine, for democracy, the alignment in values and principles, I think is just, this has been a really positive, I think, and really, it makes me more excited to wake up tomorrow and get going for next year's CEPA Forum. But Amelia, I think we want to thank some of our folks. So I'll start. I'll thank our partners, of course, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Google, Lockheed Martin Corporation, Leviathan Design, and Mercedes-Benz, the embassies of Czechia, Slovakia, Romania, and New Strategy Center for their wonderful support of this year's forum, and our media partners, Euractiv, Defense One, and Political. Thank you so much for joining us.
Wonderful. And this CEPA Forum simply wouldn't be possible without all of the people behind the scenes making it happen. So I wanted to give a special shout out to Michael Newton, who is the engine behind this entire operation. He's been steadfast and wonderful and helping us through all of the technical difficulties and struggles. And it's just absolutely wonderful to work alongside him. Also to Sarah Krajewski, who has been behind all of our outreach on social media, keeping us all up to date with the conversations, discussions, and keynotes. So massive thank you to Sarah. Also to Reese Phillips, who has been helping keep the office in order behind the scenes as we keep going through this 3-day forum. Thank you, Reese. And also to our wonderful team members on the Transatlantic Defense and Security Program, as well as the Democratic Resilience Program and our Digital Innovation Initiative. All of the work that you did to make this forum as fantastic as it was. We thank you so much for your dedication, for your deep, intelligent input to all of these conversations. So thank you all so much.
And thank you to you, Amelia, for all the work that you've put into this year's forum. And for those of you that are watching, as we wrap up, please continue to follow us using cepa.org and across all of our social media channels, including Instagram. We will see you next year. Thank you. #Meet the Moment is still going. Thank you so much. See you next year.
Thank you, everyone.
This war is not just a war against Ukraine. It's a war against what they called the West. And so we have to see and to understand if Ukraine fail, then we have no peace.
Putin, in a way, has whatever support he might have had before the war, he may have lost some of it simply by the sheer brutality and viciousness of this war.
Vladimir Putin has been successful at just one thing over the past 6 months, creating a stronger and more united NATO than ever before.
In the coming years, in order to compete with Russia and China, the Transatlantic Alliance will need to prioritize the adoption and integration of new cutting-edge defense technologies.
This could be spelling the beginning of the end of the war. And I think in the past few weeks, we've, for the first time, had realistic hopes of the capacity of Ukraine actually to push back.
NATO has strengthened its military posture to shield NATO allies during Russia's forced buildup and invasion of Ukraine.
That one of the most effective ways of disrupting disinformation is to pre-bunk it, to forewarn people that it's about to happen, to inoculate people about it. And that means when something new happens, you have to articulate it in a way that doesn't give a hook for a bad actor who's looking for a fight to pick.
This war is far from over. Ukrainians have proved it winnable. Ukraine has shown us that high morale and excellent leadership are as important as military power.
Even though maybe the EU is further advanced in terms of regulation than the US is, for reasons which I think we all know, in terms of the problem analysis, I think we see largely eye to eye.
Ukrainians have proven that we can fight and we are ready to win. But we need weapons. These weapons will help to strengthen Europe's and NATO's eastern border. I call on everyone who is now celebrating the Ukrainians' fight for freedom to help us get weapons. The only road to peace is our victory, after all.
The situation on the front of Ukraine's heroic defense against Russian invasion changes every day. This is what our response should also do. Dynamically grow to meet the evolving challenges, both on the ground, helping people in Ukraine, neighboring countries, and in the cyberspace.
Ukrainians cannot afford to have war fatigue because they are living this war every day.
The transatlantic relationship between North America, the US, Canada, and Europe has been fundamental and key to ensuring peace in Europe for more than 70 years.
How can we meet this moment? I want to talk about 3 ways. First, we will continue to support Ukraine and the aspirations of its people. Second, we will hold Russia accountable for its abuses and work to ensure this war is a strategic failure for Putin. And finally, we will deepen our commitment to the Transatlantic Alliance so we can emerge from this crisis stronger and even more united.
Every state that supports a world based on international law and human rights, free from the threat of aggression and coercion, is an ally.
We will succeed because we do not have a luxury not to, but also because our strength is in our values, our unity, our transatlantic bond.
Every time we think that Putin plays like a 10-dimensional chess, we are mistaken. We constantly, over the last years, overestimate his competence and underestimate his will. So these things are stupid. They would not help him. He's digging his own grave. That's because they're like sleepwalking into a huge disaster.
Cyber attacks are not a separate front, but rather an extension of the conflict. Russia has invested a lot of scale and resources into the sophistication of its cyber weapons.
The transatlantic community must once again become a model and beacon of lights, the way for nations through the turbulent seas of history.
The strength and resilience of the Ukrainian people has illustrated the importance of America's investments in and commitments to European security.
When the shooting stops, the war won't be over. Ukraine must win the peace as well as the war.
We must continue our pressure on Moscow, our support for Ukraine, and we must strengthen our resilience at home. Because in the end, this is what protecting a free Europe means in practice.
This is not just our fight. This is the battle for the foundational values of the free world. This is the battle for who gets to dictate the new world order. Is it the tyrants or is it democracies?